Randall delivered a sharp, slashing blow to Stella's face with the base of his palm, and the impact was so powerful that she barely maintained her upright position, frantically clinging to the ledge of the granite kitchen counter. An empty tin can of lager clattered against the countertop, serving as a mute reproach for its room temperature. It was this minor offense that provoked his next violent outburst of aggression. He looked at her with contempt, cold as steel, as if she was guilty not only of the warm drink, but also of the utter ruin of his life. Then he abruptly turned around and retreated into the master bedroom, throwing something inarticulate and insulting about its uselessness. At dawn, he tossed a compact case of matting powder onto the counter where she was preparing breakfast and said in a tone that suggested no objections, "My executive partner will arrive today for the contract documents. Make your face look decent, and don't you dare say a word about anything." Stella picked up the briefcase with trembling fingers, feeling the left side of her face throbbing and aching in the place where his stroke had been the day before. She was sure that any attempt at resistance or explanation would only worsen her situation, so she nodded silently and hurried into the adjoining bathroom. The mirrored surface ruthlessly exposed the aftermath of the incident. A deep, plum-colored bruise spread across the face from the zygomatic bone, reaching to the temple, and significant swelling made the left eye visually smaller than the right. Stella opened the case and began to apply cosmetics to the injured area with careful movements. Every touch caused piercing pain, but she endured it, realizing that there was no other way. The powder was distributed in irregular patches, creating a strange whitish hue that drew attention to the problem, rather than hiding it. In her reflection, she saw not only physical injuries, but also deep fear in her eyes. The fear of impending contact with Randall's management, of any possible questions, of the fact that she might awkwardly let it slip. Randall was tight, lipped about his job, but Stella knew that his boss was an inflexible and extremely demanding man. Otherwise, how could one explain her husband's constant internal tension and his sharp outbursts of anger after working hours? Stella imagined a stern, middle-aged gentleman with piercing eyes, capable of intimidating a subordinate to the verge of a nervous breakdown. When she was done with her disguise, she returned to the kitchen where Randall was finishing his espresso, scrolling through the electronic news on his device. He looked up and critically assessed her efforts. "It won't get any better, and it'll do," he mumbled, staring at the screen again. Stella felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She sat down opposite and asked with restraint, "What time should I expect a visit, and do I need to prepare some kind of treat?" Randall tore his gaze away from her, full of clear warning. "He's coming in the afternoon. The documentation is on the sofa table in the living room." "It's very simple," he said, pushing his empty cup away. "But understand, Stella, if you say a single word to him beyond measure, if he suspects something is wrong, then yesterday's bruise will seem like a slight pinch to you." His voice was flat, almost emotionless, but the threat was so obvious that it took her breath away. She nodded, not daring to make a sound, and he chuckled contentedly. The rest of the morning dragged on in painful anticipation. Randall left on official business, promising to return before the arrival of the executive partner, and Stella rushed around the apartment, trying to distract herself by restoring order. She wiped spotlessly clean surfaces, randomly rearranged objects, but her thoughts invariably returned to the upcoming meeting. All possible conversation scenarios were running through her head, and each of them ended with her making a mistake and incurring her husband's wrath. The contract documents on the sofa table in the living room were neatly folded into a leather briefcase. Stella didn't dare study them, but she caught a glimpse of the official forms and a lot of financial calculations. Randall's work at a large development corporation had always seemed remote and vague to her. He never shared operational details with her, confining himself to complaining about his superiors and coworkers. The only thing she knew for sure was that this position provided significant wealth, judging by how dramatically their standard of living had increased over the past couple of years. At about 2:50 p.m., the doorbell rang briefly. Stella shuddered, even though she had been preparing for this moment, and hurried to the door. Randall hadn't returned yet, but she remembered his instruction that the executive director might arrive earlier. Looking through the peephole lens, she saw the tall silhouette of a man in a dark business suit. Her heart began to beat with an alarming rhythm, and she took a deep breath and carefully turned the lock. The door opened, and Stella saw a man whose appearance she had never expected. Gavin stood on the threshold, still as tall and noble as in her memories, but more mature and confident. His dark brown hair was carefully styled, and there was the same warmth in his eyes that she remembered from high school. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop, and they froze, looking at each other, unable to believe this fateful coincidence. "Stella," he whispered, and there was a mixture of bewilderment and something else in his voice that she couldn't process. She tried to answer, but her voice betrayed her. Gavin was her first deep love, her senior classmate, whom she dated before graduating from high school. Then they were sure that their journey together would last forever. But fate separated their paths, sending them to various metropolises and educational institutions. Their contact ended many years ago. And so, Gavin, now her husband's executive partner, stood in front of her on the threshold. Gavin's gaze quickly skimmed over her face and lingered on her left cheekbone, where the compact powder could not completely hide the dark spot under her eye. His expression changed instantly. Affability and amazement were replaced by a chilling rage that made the muscles of his jaw tense like stones. He paused for a few moments, studying her features with such intensity that Stella instinctively leaned back. In his eyes, she caught the same expression she remembered from childhood, when he defended her from school bullies. Randall shouted loudly from the depths of the apartment, and the sound of his footsteps approached the entrance area. Stella felt her insides clench with panic. She had no idea how to explain her acquaintance with her husband's supervisor without violating his categorical prohibition on excessive chatter. Gavin seemed to sense her predicament and shook his head slightly, signaling that it was better now to keep quiet about their previous relationship. A strictly formal expression appeared on his face when Randall appeared in the aisle. "Good afternoon, Mr. Banks," Gavin said in a voice devoid of any hint of warmth. "Gavin Williams, new head of corporate finance." Randall visibly froze upon hearing this performance, and Stella realized that he hadn't been expecting this particular man's visit. Her husband held out his hand to shake, but Gavin only touched it lightly with his fingertips, demonstrating an unwillingness to make closer contact. A heavy silence hung in the air, which Randall tried to dispel with an unnatural smile. "Please come in. The documents are ready," Randall squeezed out, letting his partner go ahead and giving his wife a sharp, warning look. Stella obediently went to the studio kitchen, but she could feel Gavin's gaze following her. In his eyes, she saw not only the anger caused by the bruise on her face, but also something else, a firm determination that both terrified and gave a glimmer of hope. She began to boil water for tea, even though no one had asked for it, just to keep her hands busy and not show excessive excitement. Muffled voices came from the living room. Gavin spoke clearly and in a businesslike manner, asking questions about projects and financial statements, while Randall answered with obvious tension. Stella could hear the rustle of papers as her husband tried to explain something, but Gavin's intonation remained cold and formal. There were pauses from time to time, during which she felt that the supervisor was assessing her husband as carefully as he had previously studied her face on the threshold. 30 minutes later, the conversation in the living room died down, and footsteps were heard. Randall escorted Gavin to the exit, discussing deadlines and additional reporting. Stella looked out of the kitchen and saw Gavin putting folders in his leather briefcase without taking his eyes off her husband. There was a special methodical quality to his actions, as if he were recording every detail of what was happening. Randall nervously adjusted his tie and nodded, agreeing with his partner's demands. "I'm going to need to reanalyze all the financial reports for the last 24 months, Gavin announced, snapping his briefcase shut. "Spending on raw materials and subcontractors for the Maple Street facility is of particular interest." Randall paled noticeably at the mention of this address, and Stella noticed how his hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. There was a tension in the space that could be felt physically, and she realized that something much more serious was going on between these two men than an ordinary work meeting. "Goodbye, Mr. Banks. I'll see you at the corporate office tomorrow at 8:45 a.m., Gavin said, heading for the exit. His gaze briefly crossed Stella's, and she saw so much pain and compassion in his eyes that she could barely hold back tears. There was more understanding and care in that fleeting glance than she had received from her husband during the entire period of their marriage. Gavin gave her a slight nod and left, leaving behind a light trail of expensive cologne and a sense of impending change. Randall slammed the front door and leaned against it, panting. His face was damp with perspiration, and there was a fear in his eyes that Stella had never seen before. He stood motionless for a few minutes, clearly trying to pull himself together, and then slowly turned to his wife. Suspicion and malice flashed in his gaze, which made her heart race. Something about the new head's behavior bothered him greatly, and she was afraid that he would blame her for it. "I'm leaving on an urgent matter. I'll be back late tonight," he said abruptly, ripping his jacket off the hanger. "If anyone calls or arrives, don't let anyone in and notify me immediately." His voice sounded strained, and Stella realized that meeting Gavin had deeply disturbed him. He left without saying goodbye and slammed the door so hard that the glass in the window frames shook. Stella was left alone in the apartment, where the smell of her husband's fear and the memory of Gavin's warm gaze still lingered. She returned to the kitchen and sat at the counter, trying to process what had happened. Meeting Gavin turned her whole perception of that day upside down. The boy she loved at school has become an influential man, now controlling her husband. He noticed the bruise on her face and realized the truth that she hadn't told anyone. In his eyes, she saw not only sympathy, but also a kind of determination that both scared and fueled the hope that her life could change. The phone rang an hour after Randall left. Stella looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. She hesitated for a few seconds, remembering her husband's prohibition not to let anyone in, but strong curiosity got the better of her. "Hello," she said carefully, and heard a familiar voice that made her heart beat faster. "It's Gavin. Can you talk?" Stella looked around, even though she knew she was alone, and quietly replied in the affirmative. "Stella, I need to tell you something." "This is extremely important," he said in a serious tone. "What I saw on your face today, and what I know about your husband in the service, is unacceptable. He's going to be arrested tomorrow morning on suspicion of large-scale embezzlement, and you should be prepared for that." Gavin's words sounded like a thunderclap out of the blue, and Stella felt like she was losing ground. She gripped the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white, trying to digest what she had heard. "Please like this story so that our platform knows about your interest in such videos and recommends more high-quality stories." Gavin spoke calmly, but each of his phrases fell on Stella like a heavy press. "Randall has been embezzling the corporation's funds for more than 2 years, entering into fictitious agreements with subcontractors and increasing the cost of supplies. The total amount of illegal seizures exceeds $4 million, and the federal investigation has irrefutable evidence of his guilt." Stella listened, feeling her world crumble, and tried to comprehend the scale of her husband's machinations. She never wondered where the money for expensive interior items, electronics, and her new fur coat came from. "Remember how your financial situation has changed over the past 2 years," Gavin continued. "New SUV, global apartment renovation, premium purchases. All this was paid for with stolen money." Stella looked around and really saw her house with different eyes. The widescreen TV on the wall, the leather couch Gavin was sitting on today, luxury kitchen appliances. All this appeared gradually, and Randall attributed the purchases to bonuses and successful projects. Now she realized that she was living in luxury built on theft, and this realization made her physically uncomfortable. "Stella, you have to understand that when he is arrested, an official investigation will begin, and he will also be called in for questioning," Gavin said very gently. "The investigators will find out if you knew about your husband's criminal activities. Was she involved in money laundering?" Her hands were shaking so much that she could barely hold the phone. The thought of being accused of complicity terrified her. She didn't know anything about Randall's dark schemes, though. But who would believe a thief's wife, who enjoyed the fruits of his crimes? "But there is a way to avoid all these serious problems," Gavin continued, and there was a new hopeful intonation in his voice. "You need to leave town today before he gets home and suspects anything. I have reliable contacts in another state who will help you find a job and rent a place to live. Stella was silent, trying to process what she had heard. Gavin's offer sounded like salvation, but it also demanded an immediate decision from her that she wasn't ready for, to leave everything and leave with a man whom she had not seen for many years, completely trusting him. "What if I stay and provide all the information to the investigation?" she asked in a barely audible voice. "What if I become a key witness against him?" Gavin was silent for a few seconds, and she heard his heavy exhale. "Stella, have you seen what he can do to you over an uncooled lager?" he finally said. "Imagine what happens when he realizes that you can send him to federal prison for a long time. He will stop at nothing to keep you silent or get rid of the witness completely." These words sounded like a final verdict, and Stella realized that she really had no choice. "I need some time to think about it," she whispered, even though deep down she had already found the answer. "We don't have time," Gavin replied. "He can come back at any moment, and tomorrow morning it will be too late. Stella, I know we haven't talked in a long time, and you don't have to trust me, but I can't stand by and watch what happens to you." She heard the same sincerity in his voice that had once made her fall in love with him. Even after years of separation, he was ready to help her without demanding any compensation. "Where will we meet?" she asked, and heard Gavin exhale in relief. "I'll be waiting for you in 1 hour at the main entrance to the park on River Street, near our old bench," he said. "Take only the essentials: identification cards, some clothes. We will purchase everything else at our new place of residence." Stella nodded, even though he couldn't see her, and felt something inside her change irreversibly. For the first time in many years, she made a decision on her own, without looking back at her husband's opinion and without fear of his reaction. After Gavin ended the conversation, Stella sat down on the couch and tried to concentrate. There was a dwelling around her that she considered her hearth, the objects she was used to, the life that seemed settled, despite all its horror. But now she knew that it was all built on deception and crimes, and she herself was not a spouse, but a prisoner of a man who was willing to do anything for personal gain. The bruise on her face throbbed, reminding her of what would happen if she stayed. She got up and went into the bedroom, pulling out a small travel bag from the wardrobe. It contained only vital items: underwear, a pair of knitted t-shirts, trousers, and a warm sweater. She took away her passport, marriage certificate, higher education diploma, and a small amount of cash, which she kept in a jewelry box. "I didn't want to take anything else." Every single thing in this house now reminded her of years of humiliation and fear. In the hallway, she paused at the mirror and looked at her reflection. A pale face with a poorly hidden bruise, frightened eyes, tightly compressed lips. That's how she's been lately. A woman who was afraid to take an extra breath so as not to anger her husband, who moved around the house on tiptoe and flinched at every loud sound. But today, something has changed. There was a spark of determination in her gaze that hadn't been there in ages. The sound of the keys turning in the lock made her heart jump in horror. Randall returned earlier than she expected, and the bag of belongings was still in her hands. She hurriedly threw it behind the sofa and tried to look casual, but her hands were shaking treacherously. The door opened, and the husband entered the apartment with a gloomy expression on his face and red-rimmed eyes from alcohol. He looked her over carefully, and she realized that he had smelled something. "What have you been doing here?" he asked, taking off his jacket and throwing it over the back of a chair. "Why do you look so suspicious?" Stella tried to smile, but it came out strained and fake. "I'm just a little tired," she replied, trying to sound confident. Randall came closer, and she could smell alcohol and cigarette smoke. His gaze was suspicious and malicious, the kind that preceded another outburst of aggression. "And how was the communication with the supervisor?" He continued the interrogation. "What were you talking about?" There was barely contained fury in his voice, and Stella realized that meeting Gavin had worried him a lot. She opened her mouth to respond with the familiar lie that everything had gone smoothly, but the words stuck. For the first time in many years, she did not want to obey his demands and answer humiliating questions. The silence dragged on, and Randall's face grew darker and darker. "I demand to know what happened in my absence," he repeated, raising his voice. "And don't you dare lie to me. I can see that you're hiding something." Stella looked at him and suddenly realized that she was no longer afraid. Yes, she knew that he could hit, he could scream and threaten, but fear no longer held down her will. Tomorrow, this man would be arrested, and her nightmare would be over. She only needed to hold out for a few hours, and then she would be free. Stella's silence lasted only a few moments, but it was enough for Randall to become completely enraged. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her violently, so hard that her teeth chattered. "What are you hiding from me?" he shouted, and drops of saliva fell on her face. His fingers dug into her skin, leaving painful prints, and his eyes burned with a fury she had never seen before. Stella tried to pull away, but his grip was too tight. "Did you say something to that supervisor?" Randall shook her harder and harder, and she felt her head dangle helplessly from her neck, like a puppet. "No, I didn't say anything," she tried to object, but he wasn't listening. There was the panic of a hunted beast in his gaze, ready to devour anyone who stood in his way. He released her shoulders, only to swing and slap her across the face with his open palm. The blow landed squarely on yesterday's bruise, and the pain exploded in his head in a deafening flash. Stella screamed and tried to defend herself with her hands, but Randall grabbed her wrist and pinned her against the wall. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. His face was only inches from hers. "I saw the way he looked at you. I saw that there was something between you. How do you know him?" She tried to explain that they just went to school together, but the words stuck in her throat from fear and pain. Randall punched her in the stomach, and she doubled over, gasping for breath. There was no air coming into his lungs, and a sickening pain was spreading in his stomach. "Tell the truth or I'll destroy you," he growled, grabbing her by the hair and yanking her head back. Stella saw his face through a veil of tears and realized that he was not bluffing. There was such hatred in his eyes, such a willingness to inflict injury, that she was truly afraid for her life, but even fear did not make her speak. She knew that any word would only fuel his rage. The next blow landed in the small of her back, and she fell to her knees, writhing in pain. Randall stood over her, breathing heavily, and his fists were clenched. "Do you think you can betray me? Do you think your school friend is going to save you?" He kicked her in the ribs, and she rolled onto her side, clutching her arms to her chest. The pain was so acute that black spots swam before my eyes. Breathing was difficult. Every breath was accompanied by a cutting pain in his ribs. "I'll figure it out," Randall continued, pacing the room like a trapped predator. "If it turns out that you deceived me, if you told him something, I will bury you alive. Do you understand?" Stella was lying on the cold floor, curled up and trying to protect herself from more beatings, but Randall seemed to have exhausted his ardor. He stood over her, breathing heavily, and then suddenly headed for the exit. "I need to see someone," he called over his shoulder. "And you lie here and think about what will happen if I find out the truth." The door slammed shut, and absolute silence reigned in the apartment. Stella lay on the cold surface, feeling the pain shoot through every cell of her body. The left side of his face burned with fire, his ribs ached with every breath, and there was still a dull pain in his stomach from the blow. She tried to sit up, but dizziness forced her to sit down again. The world was blurring before her eyes, and her ears were ringing so loudly that she could barely hear her own breathing. Gradually, the pain receded a little, and she was able to sit down, leaning her back against the wall. The taste of metal in her mouth reminded her that Randall had split her lip, and touching her face caused unbearable pain. She realized that this time he had beaten her much harder than ever. Previously, he was limited to 1 or 2 strokes, but today he seemed to have lost control. The fear of exposure made him even more violent and unpredictable. The phone rang when she finally made it to the couch. Gavin's number appeared on the screen, and she realized that more than an hour had passed since their previous call. "Hello," she whispered, and her voice sounded hoarse and painful. "Stella, what happened?" Gavin immediately asked after hearing her condition. "Are you at home? Is he there?" She tried to answer, but all that came out of her throat was a sob. The tears that she had been holding back all this time finally gushed out. "He beat me up," she confessed through tears. "Tougher than ever. I think he suspects something after your meeting." Gavin swore so softly that she barely heard him, but there was such fury in his voice that it even scared her. "Where is he now?" he asked sharply. Stella explained that Randall had gone to meet someone, and it was unknown when he would be back. "Great," Gavin said. "I'm coming to get you right away. Be ready in 15 minutes. Stella struggled to get up from the sofa and went to the mirror in the hallway. The reflection horrified her. The left half of his face was swollen and dark purple. Her lip was split and bleeding, and there were tears in her eyes. She looked like a victim of a traffic accident, not like a woman beaten by her own husband. But now was not the time to feel sorry for yourself. I had to pack up and leave before Randall returned and started an even more brutal massacre. The bag she had prepared earlier was still lying behind the sofa. Stella took it out and checked the contents. Documents, some clothes, money. I didn't want to take anything else. Every single thing in this apartment was a reminder of years of fear and humiliation. The only thing she added to the collection was a photo of her parents from the wedding ceremony, the only reminder of the time when she was happy and did not know what fear of her own spouse was. The sound of a car engine under the windows made her heart beat faster. Stella looked out the window and saw Gavin's black sedan. He got out of the car and headed for the entrance, moving quickly and purposefully. There was such determination in his walk that she knew he wouldn't leave her in the lurch, no matter what happened. For the first time in many years, she had someone by her side who was ready to protect her, not hurt her. The doorbell rang softly, just once. Stella picked up her bag and headed for the exit, not looking back at the apartment that had served as her prison for so many years. Gavin was standing outside the door, and when he saw her face, his jaw clenched with rage. "Oh my God, Stella, what has he done to you?" he whispered, gently touching her uninjured cheek. She saw such pain and compassion in his eyes that she started crying again. But this time the tears were not only from physical suffering, but also from relief. The nightmare was finally ending. "We have to hurry," Gavin said, taking her bag. "If he comes back and sees that you're going to run away, something irreparable could happen." Stella nodded and followed him to the elevator. She saw her battered face in the elevator mirror for the last time and realized that she would never allow anyone to treat her like that again. The elevator doors closed, cutting her off from her past life, and she felt as if something inside her was changing forever. Gavin's car was warm and quiet. He started the engine and drove out of the yard without saying a word. Stella leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, feeling the tension gradually leave her body. For the first time in years, she was safe. Next to her sat a man who would not harm her, would not shout or threaten, a man who put his career in jeopardy to save her from a criminal spouse. Randall returned to the house around midnight, swaying from alcohol and nervous exhaustion. The meeting with the accomplices did not bring relief. They also felt that the noose was tightening and everyone was thinking only of their own salvation. He went up the stairs, mentally preparing for a further confrontation with his wife, who was probably still lying on the floor where he had left her. Keys were ringing in her pocket, and thoughts were spinning in her head about how to get her to tell the whole truth about the conversation with the supervisor. The apartment greeted him with suspicious silence. Randall turned on the hallway light and instantly realized that something was wrong. The atmosphere was different, as if someone had ventilated the room. "Stella!" he shouted, heading for the living room, but there was no answer. There was no one in the room. There wasn't even a trace of blood left on the floor, which was dripping from her split lip. He searched the entire apartment, looked into every nook and cranny, checked the loggia and bathroom, but his wife was nowhere to be found. Only then did he notice that some of her clothes had disappeared from the wardrobe. The document drawer was open, but Stella's passport was missing. Randall stood in the middle of the bedroom, feeling rage and horror boiling up inside him. She had run away, and that could only mean one thing. She really had the information, and now she rushed to transfer all the information to the investigating authorities. His hands were shaking with rage as he imagined her bringing him to justice by revealing the location of the hidden funds and documentation. Rage exploded inside him like a live grenade. Randall grabbed a decorative vase from a shelf and hurled it at the wall, where it split into thousands of sharp fragments. This was followed by plates from the kitchen set, cups, photo frames. Everything that came to hand flew into the walls and flew apart with a deafening crash. He screamed and cursed, calling his wife a traitor and a vile person who sold him for the opportunity to escape. The neighbors had undoubtedly heard the mayhem, but he didn't give a damn. When the rage subsided, Randall sank to the floor among the shards and fragments of his former existence. The apartment looked like a devastated battlefield. Potsherds were everywhere. Glass fragments protruded from the broken frames, and damage from thrown objects remained on the walls. He realized that his life was collapsing at a catastrophic rate, and it was no longer possible to stop this process. Stella knew too much, and now she was free to tell the investigators everything. In the morning, Randall woke up on the couch, not undressing, with a throbbing headache from a hangover and nervous exhaustion. He brewed the strongest coffee and tried to put his thoughts in order, making an evacuation plan. It was necessary to immediately take the hidden funds, burn incriminating materials, and disappear from the city before the police raided. He still had some contacts in other regions, people who could help him escape and start a new existence under an assumed name. He took a shower, put on clean clothes, and went to work, trying to keep his usual appearance. The office was filled with the usual work bustle. The staff discussed current projects. The secretaries were delivering correspondence. The phone lines were ringing incessantly. Randall sat down at his desk and tried to concentrate on his tasks, but his thoughts kept returning to his runaway wife and the possible consequences of her escape. Every phone call made him shudder with tension. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, 3 men in dark business suits entered the office. Randall knew who they were right away, even before he saw the service badges. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hear it pounding in his ears, and his mouth was dry with horror. "Mr. Randall Banks," said the eldest of them, approaching the table. "You are being arrested on suspicion of embezzlement of corporate assets on an especially large scale. You have the right to remain silent and request the presence of a lawyer." The handcuffs snapped on his wrists with a metallic click that sounded like a guilty verdict. Randall offered no resistance. He understood that the game was over, and resisting would only make his situation worse. His colleagues watched in amazement and fear. Someone was whispering in the corner, discussing what had happened. The secretary covered her mouth with her hand, unable to believe that the calm and respectable Randall Banks turned out to be a criminal. At the police station, he was taken to a small interrogation room with bare walls and one skylight. The investigator turned out to be a middle-aged man with tired eyes and an indifferent expression on his face. He had seen hundreds of such cases. He spread out folders with documents and photographs on the table and then activated the dictaphone. "So, Mr. Banks, let's start from the beginning," he said in a monotone voice. "We have irrefutable evidence of your illegal manipulation of the corporation's finances." The investigator read out the testimony of witnesses, including the company's accountants, subcontractors, and even some employees who saw Randall receiving kickbacks for inflated bills. But the most terrifying moment for him was when the investigator opened a separate folder and said, "Now let's discuss the testimony of your wife, Mrs. Stella Banks." Randall felt the blood drain from his face, and his stomach clenched with panic. She really betrayed him, told the investigation everything she knew. "Your wife informed us about a cache of cash in the wall behind the freezer," the investigator continued, flipping through the papers. "She also pointed to the second hiding place in the garage box where you hid fake letterheads and seals. In addition, she provided evidence of systematic physical abuse against her, which was confirmed by a medical examination." Randall listened and couldn't believe that his own wife, whom he considered downtrodden and weak-willed, had managed to expose him so thoroughly. But how could she know about the hiding places, he asked, unable to stand it. I never told her. The investigator grinned and shook his head. You underestimated your wife, Mr. Banks. Women are very observant, especially when they live in constant fear. She saw you hiding the money, heard your phone conversations, memorized the details. And most importantly, she is no longer afraid of you because she is under the protection of the state. At the detention center, Randall was placed in a shared cell with 3 other prisoners. They were men of different ages serving sentences for various offenses, but they were all united by their contempt for those who offend women. When one of the cellmates found out what the newcomer was arrested for, the atmosphere in the cell instantly heated up. So he beat up his wife, said the head of the camera, a huge guy with tattoos on his arms. And we don't welcome such people here. Randall remembered what followed as a nightmare. His cellmates arranged an educational event for him, which was more like a brutal massacre. They explained to him the concept of male honor and how to treat ladies, reinforcing their words with cuffs and kicks. Only a true coward raises his hand against someone who is weaker, they said, methodically beating him. Cowards are not respected or protected here. When the beating was over, Randall was lying on his bunk, covered in bruises and abrasions, and for the first time in many years, he understood how his wife felt after each of his fits of rage. The pain permeated his entire body, it was difficult to breathe, and every movement was accompanied by a new outburst of suffering. He realized that years of humiliation and fear awaited him in prison, and no one would come to his rescue, as Gavin had once come to Stella's aid.